You guys can see my screen, right?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay. Vardhaman, are you recording this? Okay, ठीक है. Thanks. Okay, तो let me start this. इसको बहुत ज़्यादा बड़ी प्रेजेंटेशन नहीं है, एंड अगेन दिस इज़ मोर ऑफ ए आउटलाइन ऑफ ए थॉट रेदर देन एक मतलब कि मैं यहाँ पे बैठ के ज्ञान दे रहा हूँ, वैसा नहीं है. इट इज़ मेंट टू बी ए डिस्कशन. It is a bit short, so on every slide we can, if you have any questions, we can discuss on the slide itself rather than taking all the questions एकदम बाद में. Okay, so let us begin with the ये पहली slide. इसका title itself, towards a Hindu reading of Dr. Ambedkar. Now the word to be emphasized here is the word Hindu, क्योंकि so many questions might come up in general, like why do we read a Hindu reading of Ambedkar at all? Are there not already Hindu readings existing about Ambedkar? Why do we need a new one? A lot of these questions would come up. But before we can even move on to those questions, we should think about this कि जब लोग अम्बेडकर के बारे में सोच रहे हैं तो तमाम तरीके की बातें सोच रहे हैं. अगर आप सोशल मीडिया का एक कॉमन सेंस सर्वे करोगे या फिर अम्बेडकर के बारे में जो बुक्स लिखी जा रही हैं उन पे आप ध्यान दोगे, यू वुड फाइंड कि देर आर ए लॉट ऑफ डिफरेंट विचारधाराएं जो मिल रही हैं और अम्बेडकर को अपने तरीके से समझने की कोशिश कर रही हैं. ब्रॉडली स्पीकिंग कितने तरीके की रीडिंग्स मौजूद हैं, मतलब थियोरेटिकली हम लोग ऐसा बोल सकते हैं कि जितने लोग हैं उतनी रीडिंग्स हैं, बट बहुत ही ब्रॉड लेवल पे अगर हम देखें तो 3-4 तरीके के मेन लोग लेसन्स ड्रॉ करते हैं अम्बेडकर की लाइफ और उनके वर्क से. तो लेट अस फर्स्ट थिंक अबाउट व्हाट आर दीज मेन ways of interpreting and understanding Ambedkar. So the first one is, of course, all of these readings also have embedded within them an idea of who Ambedkar is, why is he important, and his whole personality. All of these are embedded in all of these readings. For example, let us think of the first one. The Dalit reading of Ambedkar emphasizes Ambedkar का खुद का एक तो उनका दलित होना, उसके अलावा his importance to Dalit history, also his contributions to Dalit politics, Dalit history, all of those things. Broadly speaking, Dalit reading, or at least the most fervent kind of Dalit reading, it promotes a kind of idea of Ambedkar in which he is reinterpreting Dalit history. He is leading as a leader of Dalits. He is arguing for Dalit rights, and as a person who was involved in the constitution, because that role is very important to the Dalit reading of Ambedkar. He is like the key leader who got them some rights which were not previously available to them. So Dalit reading is of Ambedkar is very like in a very fundamental sense thinks of Ambedkar as a person who moved Dalit history forward in India. ये बेसिक दलित रीडिंग है. इसके बेसिक आइडियाज क्या हैं कि जो दलित वर्ग है, हाउ सो एवर डिफाइंड, ये सोशली जो है डिप्राइव्ड ग्रुप था इन मैनी वेज, एंड in the conditions of modernity, again I won't define them, in the conditions of modernity in which India found itself, it started coalescing politically, socially, culturally, and asserting for its rights. And that coalition or that movement of coming together, that finds an expression in idea of Dr. Ambedkar, who talks about Dalits not just in a political or constitutional sense, but also deeply in a historical sense. कि इंडियन सोसाइटी में जो दलित क्वेश्चन है उसको सॉल्व करने की कोशिश करते हैं अम्बेडकर. इसलिए जो मोस्ट फर्वेंट दलित रीडिंग है अम्बेडकर की, अम्बेडकर में एक काइंड ऑफ इंटेलेक्चुअल, एक पॉलिटिकल, एक मसीहा टाइप का फिगर देखती है. तो दिस इज द दलित रीडिंग. This I would say is like the most core reading of Ambedkar, because all other kind of readings of Ambedkar would probably not happen. And matlab, this has to be said in all honesty, that if this reading did not exist, then all other people might have forgotten about Ambedkar if Ambedkar had not become a key figure, a key symbol of organization and leadership in Dalit community. Then it is possible that we might have lost Ambedkar to history. So in that sense, Dalit reading is very important to Ambedkar, and we cannot dismiss it. We have to, even if we don't accept all of it, we have to respect that this reading exists, and it probably exists for a reason. उसके अलावा फिर आती है एक अम्बेडकर की इमेंसिपेटरी रीडिंग. आई एम टॉकिंग अबाउट इमेंसिपेटरी रीडिंग इन एक इंडियन सेंस. What about people who do not think of Ambedkar merely as a Dalit icon, or people who do not relate to Ambedkar only on that singular level, or people who are not Dalits themselves, so they do not subscribe to Dalit reading? How might they think about Ambedkar? इसके अंदर एक लिबरल रीडिंग भी आ सकती है, एक मार्क्सिस्ट रीडिंग भी आ सकती है, बहुत तरीके की रीडिंग आ सकती है. बट वो सब लिखने की जगह मैंने इसको इमेंसिपेटरी रीडिंग क्यों लिखा है? क्योंकि there is a strain of thinking in India, which might have a lot of internal difference, but which is united in this singular belief कि जो भी एक इंडिया में कल्चरल अजर्शन है या फिर एक हिंदू अजर्शन है, हिंदू मैनिफेस्टेशन है, पॉलिटिक्स में हो, सोसाइटी में हो, कल्चर में हो, all of that is backward looking. It is fundamentally not good. All of these kind of spaces find a uh, readily available ally in Ambedkar. I would say कि they conveniently interpret him, and they do not have the essence of Ambedkar. But that would also be a bit convenient on my part, because a lot of different readings of Ambedkar are reading of conveniences as they are for any other great person. But basically, the point in emancipatory reading is that they find in Ambedkar a complete rejection, what they think is a complete rejection of India's past. And that is why in this reading, Ambedkar becomes a tool to argue about the fact that all manifestation or all assertion of any pride in India's past, all of India's culture, everything, that is basically backward looking. And Ambedkar is a key figure of emancipation in this movement. Now we come to a third kind of reading. Now I don't think there is a singular global reading of Ambedkar, but at least one kind of reading that has been gaining ground. Uh, it is also sort of emancipatory, but the reason that it is distinct from that national kind of emancipatory reading is that it thinks of Ambedkar as a figure of the suppressed, as a figure of social justice. And in a global sense, there are a lot of different figures who have brought these ideas of social justice to their respective populations. All of One important feature of these people is that all of them are identified with some disadvantaged group. Uh, One simple example would be, say, Nelson Mandela, his identification with the black people, or say Martin Luther King. So at least one kind of prominent global reading is which thinks of Ambedkar as the leader of Dalits, and his movement for Dalit assertion and Dalit pride as a question of global significance, in the same sense that Nelson Mandela is identified with Dalits, or Martin Luther King is identified with Dalits, or many other people of this category. One important question here is, or one important thing to note here is that in this reading, the whole national question of Ambedkar that becomes moot. In this reading, the whole movement or whole thinking basically becomes a social question of a great person overcoming social prejudice to lead his community to freedom. That is the basic idea of a global reading. So it kind of dwarfs the that nationalistic interface. All of that is dwarfed in this reading. The fourth thing I have written here is Hindu reading, and I have applied a question mark because I can't think of any kind of deep reading that has engaged with Ambedkar on his own terms. Uh, One kind of a reading of Hindu reading of Ambedkar is Gandhian. We see that in Gandhi's engagement with Ambedkar, and I think there is a lot of historical lesson in that, but I don't think that is deep enough or relevant enough for us today. And one problem I have with that reading is that it is a bit superficial. It claims Hindu leader, but all it does is it kind of brushes aside a lot of points that Ambedkar is making. उसके अलावा हमारे पास अंबेडकर की हिंदुत्व रीडिंग भी है, but again, I won't say the problem there is intention, but I think the problem there is depth probably, uh, which is the reason why a lot of Hindutva reading of Ambedkar has been criticized for like merely superficially embracing some side of him and only trying to appropriate him. I think that is probably not the intention, but regardless, I think it has not been deep enough. So those are the kind of readings of Ambedkar that we have seen so far. I think if you think about it deeply, you might come up with like one or two more of these. But I think this broadly covers a lot of diversity of how Ambedkar is received and perceived. Sarthak is asking, can you please suggest some Hindutva reading of Ambedkar? हिंदुत्व रीडिंग ऑफ अम्बेडकर में अगेन वैसे तो मैं थोड़ा डिसअपॉइंटेड हूँ, बट एक बेसिक रीडिंग अम्बेडकर के ऊपर एक हिंदी में किताब लिखी गई थी, उनका नाम क्या है, दत्तोपंत ठेंगड़ी जी ने जो अम्बेडकर के ऊपर किताब लिखी है. आई थिंक दैट इज एक at least on intention level that is a very concrete book. तो you can refer to that, दत्तोपंत ठेंगड़ी's book on Ambedkar. उसके अलावा भी मेरे दिमाग में एक दो तीन आ रही हैं, बट those are not books, they are मतलब pamphlet type of things, so I don't think I would consider them बहुत seriously. But at least one book that I have in mind is Dattopant Thengdi's book. I think that can be consulted for whoever is interested. uh, so let's now move to the Islam through Ambedkar size is हाँ, इसमें यहाँ पे और बहुत सारी सजेशंस हैं, इसको भी आप देख सकते हो. That settles the question of what kind of readings are there for Ambedkar. So now we come to the main question: ki if we are thinking about a Hindu reading of Ambedkar, then is there even a need for this? And if there is a need, why? What exactly is the need? I think there are 3 or 4 important reasons why a Hindu reading of Ambedkar. मेरे लिए क्वेश्चन एक्चुअली कॉमन सेंसिकल है, मतलब उसको समझाने की जरूरत नहीं है, बट स्टिल वो कॉमन सेंस के अंदर का सेंस जो है उसको भी मैं थोड़ा एक्सप्लोर करना चाहूंगा. मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि बहुत ही इंपॉर्टेंट रीजन अम्बेडकर को समझने का फ्रॉम हिंदू पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू, और थोड़ा डिस्पैशनेट होके, मतलब बहुत ज़्यादा इमोशनल और प्रिजुडिस्ड होके नहीं, थोड़ा डिस्पैशनेट होके समझने का एक रीज़न, बहुत सारे हैं, उनमें से कुछ एक रीज़न मैंने यहाँ पे लिखे हैं. एक तो ये है कि regardless of what people might want or think or whatever idea they might have, it is important to acknowledge that if you think of caste as a question, if you think of caste as an important question, for several reasons, Ambedkar is like at the core of this question. इसका रीजन एक्चुअली क्लियर है, क्योंकि सबसे ज़्यादा कंक्रीट लेवल पे, सबसे ज़्यादा डेप्थ के साथ, एंड एक एनालिसिस वाले एंगल के साथ भी कास्ट के क्वेश्चन पे सबसे ज़्यादा अम्बेडकर नहीं सोचा है. तो एक तो वो रीजन दैट कैन बी कॉल्ड लाइक इंटेलेक्चुअल रीजन, बट ऑल्सो फ्रॉम ए लॉट ऑफ डिफरेंट पॉलिटिकल imperatives अराउंड Ambedkar is like at the core of the caste question when it comes to Indian discourse. So if you do not have a understanding of Ambedkar, and by understanding I do not mean blind acceptance or blind rejection, but a layered understanding of Ambedkar, if it is not there, then I think इंटेलेक्चुअल लेवल पे यू आर नॉट एक्सेप्टिंग द कास्ट क्वेश्चन, उसकी इम्पोर्टेंस क्या है. योर attitude to the caste question is highly emotional probably, or not judicious, I would say. So to be taken seriously on the caste question, I think there is a need to evolve. There is a very basic and minimum need to evolve a clear understanding of what Ambedkar says and how to deal with that. The second point here is the need for historical whole sense. What I mean is, no Hindu understanding of our own history can be complete without taking into account last 200 years, which have been like very, I would say, vibrant, not always positive, but which have been full of dynamism, and a lot of history has been accomplished for Indian nation as such, but also Hindu society in particular in the last 200 years. इसमें देर आर ए लॉट ऑफ डिफरेंट पीपल एंड ए लॉट ऑफ डिफरेंट थिंग्स दैट हैव हैपेंड. उसके बारे में भी मैं बात नहीं करूँगा, बट आई वुड जस्ट गिव एन एग्जांपल ऑन द क्वेश्चन ऑफ हिंदुइज्म एंड इट्स ओरिएंटेशन टू पॉलिटिक्स. ये मैंने जो पिछली बार हमारा सेशन हुआ था उसमें बोला था कि सावरकर हैज़ अकम्प्लिश्ड सम ग्रेट intuitions which have so far in history eclipsed or not been available to Hindu society or Hindu culture as a whole. So Savarkar stands as a really great person in history हमारे पिछले 200 सालों की for that reason. I think Ambedkar in the broader national sense has also acquired that stature because what Savarkar is to politics, at least in my scheme of things, Ambedkar is to society. If Savarkar, from a Hindutva point of view, was obsessed with the question of the political and how to solve for it, then Ambedkar was not merely a Dalit thinker, but on a civilizational level, on a national level, he was interested in the idea of perfection of society. तो अगर हम हिंदू सोसाइटी का अपना जो सेंस ऑफ सेल्फ है, मतलब जो हिंदू हिस्ट्री है, it is actually matlab prehistorical. It is like it starts with the Vedic idea of things. Then a lot of things are happening. But you can't have a Hindu history or Hindu sense of self or Hindu sense of history without making a total sense of how India as a nation or Hindus as a culture and as a society, how they came to terms with modernity, with concepts of modernity, with concept of coloniality. How did they respond to that? What kind of changes happened within us? What kind of changes happened all around us to take to respond to these questions? तो उस सेंस में पिछले 200 साल का जो इतिहास है उसको अपने खुद के सेंस ऑफ हिस्ट्री और सेंस ऑफ सेल्फ के लिए ऑर्गेनाइज करने में, if we don't make sense of Ambedkar, then I think we are leaving a very critical gap, which would amount to not just intellectual dishonesty, but also a kind of social dishonesty. इसलिए I think Ambedkar को समझना और उनकी बातों को assimilate करना I think important है. तीसरा जो मैंने यहाँ पे रीजन लिखा है, आई थिंक a lot of people might not agree with this, but I actually see a lot of potential in Ambedkar. And because we are saying that this is a Hindu reading of history, and because that idea cannot be diverse from religion, I think Ambedkar should really be thought of as a man of religion. Uh, this is not just because of his engagement with Buddhism, but even in general, I think there have been people like Gandhi, who I think was also a sort of religious figure. There have been other people, but Ambedkar is a very critical person who engaged with Indian religion in modern terms. So, in a sense of learning or in a sense of curiosity, in that sense also, I think it is important to do a Hindu reading of Ambedkar. व्हेन वी टॉक अबाउट एक हिंदू रीडिंग ऑफ अम्बेडकर, तो इसमें मैंने 2-3 चीज़ें क्लियर कर दी हैं. मैंने रीडिंग वर्ड क्लियर कर दिया है, मैंने अम्बेडकर के बारे में क्लियर कर दिया है. अब क्वेश्चन आता है हिंदू जो शब्द मैंने यूज़ किया है उसके बारे में. महेंद्र सिंह धोनी वांट्स टू जॉइन द कॉल. Let us see which kind of Dhoni. Okay, so now it comes to कि जो मैं the word that I'm using, the Hindu word that I'm using, तो यहाँ पे what ground am I talking about? Because I think it is a given कि if we are talking about a Hindu reading of Ambedkar, then a certain kind of pretext or a context is it has to be there. Otherwise, we would have no ground to do that reading with. तो just to clear that question and to make my own ideas clear here कि मैं किस तरीके से अप्रोच कर रहा हूँ, मैंने यहाँ पे दो तीन चीज़ें डिफाइन की हैं. पहली तो ये है कि when we think of Hinduism as a ground to understand anyone or to explore anyone, so these are four things that I think should be clear. The first thing is कि Hinduism is the paradigmatic religion of India. What I mean here is that India has seen a flux of religion, एक influx of religion, एक export of religion, and a dialogue of religion in many senses all throughout our history. But all of these historical combinations over time, what they have given to us is that Hinduism has been innovative enough in its theological capacity, in its social capacity, in its cultural capacity to cater to a wide variety of Indian people, despite the obvious diversity that is prevalent in India. On this criteria, Hinduism gets to say with confidence that it has been a paradigmatic religion of India for like all of Indian history, and it cannot be summarily it cannot be rejected as a way of thinking, just like outright. It has to be accepted for what it is. The second question is of history of dialogue and fluid boundaries. Now, this is also important when it comes to understanding of Hinduism. Hinduism, a lot of there is a lot of theory around how to define Hinduism. But in a basic anthropological sense, Hinduism is like an evolutionary framework of theological, cultural, social ideas, all of which have found ways to be integrated into a singular working whole, which kind of keeps evolving. And these ideas are always mixing with each other, influencing each other, and always contributing to this dynamic dialogue of Hinduism, which has always been there at the crux of Hinduism as a social, religious, or cultural thing. अगेन मतलब इसके बारे में बहुत ज़्यादा बात की जा सकती है, बट इसके ये सारे एग्जांपल्स हैं कि a lot of sects that we think of Hindu today, they might not have defined themselves in those terms at that point of time, but over time they were all assimilated into the same framework. Another example is these key concepts or the key figures of divinity, like let us say Vishnu or Shiva or Shakti. All of these were available for a wide range of combination, a wide range of innovation, a wide range of assimilation to all kinds of Indian religious histories. That is why when I say Hindu, I also imply a sense of dialogue and fluid boundaries and a sense of innovation. The third thing is again, I think it draws from the other two. The resilience and innovation that is a factor of Hinduism. So Hinduism, for a person who is very orthodox, they might be given to this understanding that Hinduism has some key. What we think of Hinduism is like eternally the same, but a basic historical understanding of Hinduism tells us that Hinduism has evolved over time. It has shown resilience in many ways. The ways in which it interacts with society, those forms have always changed over time across the geography of India. Cultural forms which you think of as Hindu in your region, other regions might have their own different cultural forms which they think are Hindu. Things like dietary restrictions or different kind of traditions around marriage, kinship, all of these things on all of these things, we see a range of adaptation across the subcontinent and a identification of all of these things with the broader Hindu understanding of things. Uh, Another question is of resilience. So I think Hinduism has shown a lot of resilience across history. First, in the Shramanic age, when the Vedic form of religion gave way to the Puranic form of religion, then I think the another next renovation came about in medieval times due to the revolution of Bhakti idea. So at a level of philosophy, at a level of sociology, at level of anthropology, at level of culture, on all of these things, Hinduism has shown a adaptive resilience and innovation across our history. And the fourth thing is obviously dharma as a key factor. So across all of these boundaries, one thing we have to accept it is that from the onset of Vedic ideas, from that period onwards, dharma has been interpreted in a very comprehensive sense. What this factor points to is that in every single dimension of human life, in all the ways that I described earlier, in all of these things, the core intuition of dharma is that all of these are connected, all of these influence each other, and also that there is a kind of perfection that is immanent to all of these dimensions, that if reawakened, that is like a key to this resilience and innovation that I'm talking about. So basically what I'm presenting here as a ground of thinking, not just Ambedkar but Hinduism as a ground of thinking, what we are coming with here is that Hinduism as a confident, a historical identity, which has acquired both breadth and depth across the Indian subcontinent, which adapted itself to many kinds of ways of thinking, and hence demands hence presents itself as a very concrete ground through which we can understand a lot of different kind of historical factors. So it is my approach here that I am using this to approach Ambedkar. So all of my arguments around how do we think of Ambedkar or how do we read Ambedkar are grounded in this understanding of Hinduism. Now we come to the question of those of you who are in SASC, Savarkar Ambedkar Study Circle, and have been there for a long time. You would have been part of that key reading that we did of Annihilation of Caste. And even after that, we did a few readings of Ambedkar, and you might have independently read a lot of Ambedkar's work. So for me, the key to understanding Ambedkar and the key to like promoting or exploring a new kind of reading, the first thing that we have to address is the thing that we often talk about, the idea of caste. So in Annihilation of Caste, which kind of summarizes his thinking on caste, because he has written similar kind of arguments in many other places. Ambedkar thinks of caste as not just as a system, but as a worldview inherent to a person who is accepting of caste, who accepts caste as a factor, who accepts caste as a factor of his social life, his cultural life, or his political life. So the key to understanding Ambedkar's argument about caste is that you can't reject this argument just by saying that if caste is not a hierarchy, it should be fine. None of these superficial arguments work there, because his analysis penetrates to the depth of caste as a psychology itself. Ambedkar thinks of caste as a problem in two ways. First, that it is against human dignity, it promotes hierarchy, all of these things. Second, it promotes a worldview that is against all sorts of ideas of brotherhood or fraternity or nationalism. A key factor why Ambedkar thought that India as a nation is a project that is underway. India as a nation has not been achieved. It is only something that we want to accomplish. is because he thought that so long as caste exists, a nation in its concrete sense cannot ever exist. What happens to Ambedkar's idea of caste, and the precise thing which is relevant to us if we are interested in Hindu reading, is that Ambedkar projects this social idea onto the spiritual plane. Ambedkar rejects Hinduism in toto. Ambedkar rejects Hinduism as a principle of life, as a religion, as a framework of thinking, as a worthy way of living life, because he thinks that this problem of caste, this points to some deeper problem in the nucleus of Hinduism, in the social thinking of Hinduism, and that social thinking is intimately connected to the spiritual ideas that come out of Hinduism. So this is the basis of Ambedkar's rejection of Hinduism as a worthy principle. That is precisely why a Hindu reading of Ambedkar would be incomplete if we only talked about uh, why what he had to say about caste and why we agree with him. That would not be good enough. That might be some kind of a reading, but that is not a penetrating Hindu reading of Ambedkar. Because we have to understand that for Ambedkar, that spiritual and social, those words, they exist in conjunction, and at least for at that period of time in which he was living and working around these questions, he came to this conclusion that the social ideas of Hinduism that promote caste are also congruent with its spiritual ideas. That is why a kind of a total giving up. I think, regardless of our ideas around caste or around other things, I think we have to preserve some of what Ambedkar is saying, but we have to reject this bundling of spiritual and social, because if this is not rejected, that then there is a comment here. The only thing which I don't like about Baba Sahib is I didn't even read original sacred texts of Sanatan full, but they need translation by Michael Azar made it. मुझे लगता है ये क्रिटिसिज्म इसलिए नहीं चलता है क्योंकि ये भी थोड़ा सा मतलब मुझे सुपरफिशियल सा लगता है, क्योंकि a lot of texts that Ambedkar is quoting, वहाँ पे प्रॉब्लम एक्चुअली ट्रांसलेशन का ही नहीं है. Some of these texts actually Ambedkar said that he got verified कि क्या मतलब ट्रांसलेशन सही है क्या by Sanskrit scholars themselves. And over time, Ambedkar himself became a person, I think, if I recall correctly, a person who was very proficient in Prakrit, must also have been in Sanskrit. I think the problem there is not of translation. The problem is that some of the texts that he quoted, and some of those texts were independently quoted by Hindu thinkers also, who were also like criticizing caste and stuff like that. They actually present a kind of social worldview, uh, which a lot of modern people might not agree with. अभी जयप्रकाश आपके क्वेश्चन पाएंगे, मैं खाली एक चीज यहाँ पे एड्रेस करना चाह रहा हूँ. तो दिस इज वाई लेट मी गो बैक टू दिस. हिंदुइज्म के अंदर जब मैं बोल रहा था ना ये डायलॉग एंड फ्रूट बाउंड्रीज, यहाँ पे एक इम्पॉर्टेंट चीज ये है कि a person who is like accepting Hinduism as a worldview, he cannot accept every single thing and every single text, because all of our social thinking, which was default at any point of time, it was arrived at by a lot of deliberation and internal dialogue and discussion and a lot of heated debate. So if you were to call all of these different texts as like basically Hindu, you would not be able to accept all of them because there would be the problem of contradiction. So I think we should think of it as a potential rather than a problem, because a lot of different ways of thinking about different things are available to us, and it also gives us some kind of freedom. to educate for ourselves, given our own current time and given our own needs, what is the best way to deal with things. If all of Ambedkar's translation was prejudiced, then you have to account for the fact that caste as a problem did exist. Caste as a problem was not made up by Ambedkar. There is a lot of I have a lot of problem with people who say that caste is only a colonial construct. Colonial problem or colonial epistemology might have magnified that problem, but that problem existed, and a kind of deep resistance to that problem is part of Indian literature and Indian philosophy also. So, what I wanted to emphasize is that when we are thinking of this key understanding of Ambedkar, in which he thinks of caste as a problem, as a deep psychological problem, and then he connects it with a social understanding, social worldview of Hinduism, and then he connects it to the spiritual ideas of Hinduism. I think from a Hindu perspective, we have to sever this connection, and this is not merely an intellectual thing. This is actually a this actually calls for एक वो अभी actually next slide उसके बारे में ही थी. This calls for a new ways of thinking, new ways of knowing, new ways of organizing. For example, I would say कि for thing or examples that already exist, Arya Samaj in Ambedkar's own time was an example of post-caste thinking within Hinduism. In our own time, a lot of different Hindu organizations like ISKCON or even RSS for that matter, RSS in a grassroots cultural sense, ISKCON in a theological sense. All of these are examples of Hindu understandings or Hindu ways of knowing and understanding and living life, which arrive at a post caste consensus, which kind of nullify the idea that this social category which in Ambedkar had a problem with, they are directly related to the spiritual understanding of Hinduism. uh, I think this I wanted to clear in the beginning itself, because if this is not rejected, then I think a Hindu reading of Ambedkar, it would not be possible. It would only be pessimistic. Now let us think about, now with that out of the way, let us think about संभावना. मतलब ये जो पूरा अम्बेडकर की अगर हम उसको समझना चाह रहे हैं, एक्सप्लोर करना चाह रहे हैं, उसके अंदर संभावनाएं, पोटेंशियल क्या क्या है. पहला तो जो मैं अभी कुछ समय पहले बात कर रहा था, अंबेडकर का जो पूरा कास्ट के ऊपर क्वेश्चन है, आई ऑल्सो एड्रेस दिस एग्जैक्ट सेम थिंग इन द लास्ट सेशन दैट वी हैड. आई थिंक it is a kind of challenge to Hinduism for those of us who accept this idea that Hinduism was in a period of stagnation. Not just in, some people might think it was due to the coming of British, some people might think it was due to the coming of Muslims, but some people definitely have this idea that उसके पहले भी कुछ problems थी, कि एक social stagnation थी हमारे अंदर, एक intellectual stagnation थी. So at least for those people, this idea that Ambedkar promotes is actually a kind of creative challenge. Ki Hinduism can be understood and can be thought of as an entirely new thing. तो यहाँ पे क्वेश्चन आ जाता है रिवाइटलाइजेशन का, कि कैन, जो हम धर्म की बात करते हैं हिंदुइज्म के अंदर, कैन, अंबेडकर तो उसको रिजेक्ट कर रहे हैं कि इट इज नॉट ए गुड, मतलब गुड एंड वर्दी रेसिपी फॉर थिंग्स. So if we are thinking about dharma as a potential for society building a perfect society, and building a perfect idea of brotherhood, building a perfect idea of fraternity, building a perfect nation, तो उन सब लोगों के लिए एक्चुअली अम्बेडकर का जो क्रिटिसिज्म है, दैट इज ए क्रिएटिव चैलेंज. क्योंकि अम्बेडकर वाज अगेन नॉट ए थियोलॉजियन, at least in the ways that he talks about in Annihilation of Caste. He says कि he personally gives up on the idea of Hindu reform because he's not interested in that. He's only interested in securing rights for the marginalized communities. But he also says कि he's a well-wisher of the idea of reform in Hindu society. But I personally think of this कि this is not a question of reform. Reform तो बहुत छोटी चीज होती है. Reform is always incremental in nature. This is a question of revitalizing and reawakening. So this is more of, in you might say, in the विवेकानंद mold of things, कि विवेकानंद की भी मतलब अंडरस्टैंडिंग कास्ट वगैरह पे वहीं पे पहुंची थी जो अम्बेडकर की अंडरस्टैंडिंग थी. बट what Vivekanand does is that he thinks of all of this as basically एक sort of किसी बहुत ही luminous एक core के around मतलब बहुत सारा मतलब pollution हो गया है. तो what Vivekanand thought of as pollution, Ambedkar rejected in toto. तो एक काइंड ऑफ हिंदू रीडिंग ऑफ दिस वुड बी इन एक मतलब काइंड ऑफ स्वामी विवेकानंद के सेंस में कि वी थिंक ऑफ दिस एज ए क्रिएटिव चैलेंज कि हिंदुइज्म is not just that. Hinduism is not merely caste system. Hinduism is also XYZ in sense of culture, in sense of society, in sense of politics, in sense of aesthetics, in many different senses. That it can be a recipe for renewal. It can be a recipe for revitalization. तो ये एक क्रिएटिव चैलेंज है जो अम्बेडकर थ्रो करते हैं और इसमें हम सीधा सीधा अम्बेडकर के साथ एंगेज कर सकते हैं. इसके अलावा दूसरी चीज आती है कि अंबेडकर ऑल्दो मतलब जो हम अंबेडकर के साथ हम उनका हिंदुइज्म के साथ संवाद देख रहे हैं तो वी सी अ लॉट ऑफ एडवर्सरियलिज्म देयर बट ऑन ए ओवरऑल लेवल ऑन इन ए वेरी ब्रॉड सेंस अंबेडकर अल्टीमेटली वाज एक डिफेंडर ऑफ द आइडिया ऑफ इंडियन रिलीजन. First of all, that book on Pakistan that he wrote, but also his decision to convert to Buddhism and not any other non-Indian religion. So there was a lot of logic that he applied towards that. तो वहाँ पे जो आइडिया निकल के आता है इंडियन रिलीजन का वो ये है कि देर आर सम काइंड्स ऑफ रिलीजियस आइडियाज दैट आर suitable टू सस्टेनेंस और nourishment of India as a society, as a culture, and India as a nation. That a lot of other religions might have denationalizing effects on Indian society. They might not be in favor of sovereignty of Indian individuals. तो वहाँ पे एक जो आइडिया ऑफ रिलीजियस फिटनेस निकल के आता है अम्बेडकर का that is solidly on the side of Indian religion. This is also an idea that is congruent with Hindu nationalism. एक तीसरी चीज यहाँ पे ये है कि इफ वी ब्रॉडन आवर अंडरस्टैंडिंग ऑफ दैट हिस्टोरिकल पीरियड ऑफ पीपल लाइक सावरकर अंबेडकर, इफ वी ब्रॉडन आवर एम्बिशन कि हमारी एम्बिशन क्या है. कुछ लोगों की एम्बिशन हो सकती है फ्रॉम ए हिंदू पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू मेयरली प्रिजर्वेशन ऑफ रिलीजन, बट आई थिंक सम पीपल हैव मोर एम्बिशियस आइडियाज लाइक हिंदुइज्म शुड अचीव इट्स राइटफुल पोटेंशियल. तो इस मामले में all of Ambedkar's criticism is to be accepted, not merely as some kind of a born out of a emotional reaction against upper caste or things like that. क्योंकि Ambedkar has been succinct in his understanding that जो problem है social problems हैं caste वगैरह की, all of these are problems uh, all of these are problems that are against the civilizational fitness itself. That all of these are problems that make civilization itself unfit for prosperity, for strength, stuff like that. So in all of these things, for those of us who think of Hinduism and Hindutva in future oriented terms, I think we find in Ambedkar a point of convergence and an ally. Ki there are some things that are to be left behind and there are some things to take up broadly on the question of with the goal of civilizational fitness in that ambition. On this question, specifically on the question of caste, actually, Ambedkar goes beyond what I described as the Dalit reading. क्योंकि Ambedkar is not interested only in social justice to the Dalits or things like that, although that is also a respectable goal. But Ambedkar is actually interested in the annihilation of caste system itself because he recognizes that this has been a problem for not just for Indian society and sense of justice, but also for Hindu unity itself. He makes that argument in his text. So on all of these questions, so long as we converge on the broader idea, on the broader future-oriented idea, I think we find an ally in Ambedkar. And again, I bring back my comparison with Savarkar that if in our 200 years of history, if Savarkar is the person from a Hindu point of view who has to be identified as a key contributor to our thinking on politics, like what should be our engagement and system around politics. What are those core questions which we should not negotiate with. So I think we find in Ambedkar a person who raised similar questions about society. This one is a bit different. I actually think of अम्बेडकर्स एम्ब्रेस ऑफ बुद्धिज्म. काफ़ी लोगों को लगता है कि मतलब एक बहुत ज़्यादा ये इट इज़ लाइक दे फील लाइक इट इज़ ए काइंड ऑफ स्लैप इन द फेस ऑफ हिंदू रिलीजन और स्टफ लाइक दैट. आई थिंक वो बहुत ज़्यादा शॉर्ट टर्म वाला व्यू है. मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि व्हेन वी थिंक ऑफ religion from a Indian point of view, and again emphasizing the idea of dialogue that I shared before, we have to think of these religious interfaces like Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, Sikhism, all of these. We have to think of these as evolving ideas of how to have the best society, how to have the best ethics, best system of ethics. All of these different ideas have contributed to each other, influenced each other in many ways towards perfection of a system of society and ethics. We know for a fact कि बुद्धिज्म के आने के बाद से इंडियन सोसाइटी में बुद्धिज्म और जैनिज्म के आने के बाद से इंडियन सोसाइटी में जो वेजिटेरियनिज्म का आइडिया था दैट वाज प्रमोटेड. एनिमल सेक्रीफाइस थोड़ी कम हुई. दैट इज जस्ट वन एग्जांपल. बट व्हाट आई एम सेइंग इज कि ब्रॉड अगर सेंस में हम रिलीजन के बारे में सोचें तो आई थिंक एक introduction of Buddhism in our current mindset, in the current discourse, we have to think of it कि जो कुछ pristine values थी वो वापस आ रही हैं और उनके साथ contrast करके we can define our own religion further. इसका सबसे सिंपल एग्जांपल क्या है कि अंबेडकर का जो ये बुद्धिज्म है, नवयान बुद्धिज्म, it was part of this movement of socially engaged Buddhism. Uh, some of you might have heard of this Vietnamese, I think he was Vietnamese or Burmese, Thich Thich Nhat ऐसे नाम से एक बुद्धिस्ट प्रीचर थे. तो ही गेव द आइडिया ऑफ ए सोशली एंगेज बुद्धिज्म कि बुद्धिज्म का जो परफेक्शन है और जो मतलब बुद्धिज्म का आइडियलिज्म है, इट शुड नॉट रिवॉल्व बेयरली अराउंड आइडिया ऑफ निर्वाण और स्पिरिचुअलिटी इटसेल्फ. इट शुड आल्सो प्रोवाइड succor to people who are deprived in society. It should also be a source of social affirmation. That was the idea which Ambedkar promoted in India through Nirvan, through Navayan. So this is just one example. We can easily take up this social engagement, religion as a social engagement. This idea can easily be taken up by Hinduism also. So that is one example in which we can think of this reintroduction of Buddhism to India as actually positive factor. So all of these were different ideas around a Hindu reading of Ambedkar. Basic conclusions that I derive from all of these ideas is: first, the need for a Hindu reading of Ambedkar, because so far most readings that we have are either liberatory or emancipatory and or a global kind of reading, all of these might teach us something, but all of these do not promote an idea of Ambedkar that is conducive to our national thinking. That is why we need a urgent Hindu reading of Ambedkar, which is true both to Ambedkar as a person and his worldview, but also true to our own grounding and our own belief in the potential of Hinduism to innovate, to revitalize itself, to renew itself. Second thing is key, we have to accept that social and social worldview of Ambedkar revolving around caste as a creative challenge. For those of us who have reached similar conclusions that Ambedkar reached, I think most people who identified with Savarkar thinking will accept that line of thinking, at least on the caste question. We have to identify that principle of Ambedkar as a sort of inspiration or a creative challenge to all of Hindu society, that you cannot be reduced to caste system or your social thinking alone. The third thing is that there is a lot of potential. I have merely outlined 2 or 3 things that I had in mind. I'm pretty sure if you guys think about these things, you will find many different areas of convergences with Ambedkar. We see in Ambedkar something, a part of whom, a part of the thinking which has to be rejected, but we also see a wide field of convergence around nationalism, around a lot of different questions. We also see an ally who is standing up for the defense of Indian religion, whose own ambition is geared towards like renewal of nationalism in India and the potential of nationalism in India. On all of these things, we find a very wide convergence with Ambedkar. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about is uh, for many people within Hinduism who might not exactly think like this, but who their thought is leading them up to these kind of areas, who think of Hinduism that it is not achieving its full potential as of now, that its social or cultural or different kinds of thinking are in stagnation. For all of those kind of people, I think Ambedkar serves as a evolutionary principle who might not belong to Hinduism, but he is not so far from us. He is also within the broader Indic religious field, so he can serve as a evolutionary source of potential for dharma, in the same way that Buddha in his own time, just basic example, Buddha in his own time served as a great source of innovation in Hindu philosophy, in Hindu metaphysics, in Hindu literature, all of a lot of perfection that we think of as the golden age of Hinduism. All of this was achieved after Buddha had talked about some problems that were inherent to Hindu society then. So, if we think of Dharma as a evolutionary principle, I think we can find in Ambedkar a ready made recipe for that kind of like evolution. So, basically, that was the presentation. Now, now we can have some questions if there are any, or merely comments or discussion points. All of those are welcome. Jay Prakash, I think you had a question in the middle. I think you can go ahead with your comment or question if there are any.
Sorry, Priyank, I pressed it by mistake. Like I was listening, I
Okay.
pressed the hand by mistake.
नहीं, गलती से भी हो गया तो अभी आप बोल सकते हो कुछ आपको बोलना है तो. There is some comment here. We call Ambedkar modern Manu, not modern Buddha. वो I think वो idea of modern Manu जो है वो I think it has specifically to do with his role in constitution, वो वाली चीज वो मैंने यहाँ पे डिस्कस नहीं की है, ऑल्दो दैट इज एक इम्पॉर्टेंट थिंग, बट यहाँ पे मैंने वो हाँ लॉ मेकर वाली चीज़ जो है अम्बेडकर का पर्सपेक्टिव वो डिस्कस नहीं किया है, क्योंकि आई थिंक देर आर मतलब थिंग्स अबाउट अम्बेडकर दैट आर मोर इम्पोर्टेंट देन जस्ट हिज बीइंग ए मतलब ड्राफ्टिंग कमेटी का चेयरमैन.
So I just had one curiosity that how do we see the Ambedkar and Periyar movement? कुछ इसमें similarities हैं because Periyar can he be an ally of Ambedkar in the whole this Hindu reforming and being a nationalistic, not leaving them nationalistic and the Hindu faith, the Hindu pantheon, and for still being a a positive critic or a प्रोग्रेसिव क्रिटिक उस सेंस में पेरियर को कैसे देखते हैं बिकॉज काफी लोग उनका भी अलायंस बनाते हैं सो आई एम नॉट रेड मच.
अच्छा, इसमें एक मैं इस चीज़ का आंसर करने के लिए मैं थोड़ा एकदम पहली स्लाइड पे जाऊंगा. जो ये अंबेडकर पेरियार का अलायंस है ना, दिस कम्स स्पेसिफिकली फ्रॉम एक बहुत ही स्पेसिफिक इमेंसिपेटरी रीडिंग ऑफ अंबेडकर. मेरी एक्चुअली अंबेडकर के अंदर जहाँ मुझे पोटेंशियल दिखता है, मुझे पेरियार के अंदर प्रॉब्लम्स दिखती हैं फॉर मल्टीपल रीजंस. लॉन्ग टर्म में मतलब देखो इंडिया में इतना ज़्यादा चीज़ें हम कर सकते हैं कि लॉन्ग टर्म में वी डोंट नो कि व्हाट पेरियार माइट सिग्निफाई. बट पेरियार के साथ मेरी प्रॉब्लम ये है कि एक तो पेरियार इज नॉट एग्जैक्टली एक मॉडर्निस्ट इन ए डीपर सेंस. पेरियार के अंदर मुझे जो साइंस और रैशनैलिटी के अराउंड पेरियार ने बातें की हैं, दे आर वेरी फेटिशिस्ट. मतलब in my understanding they are very fetishist. They do not represent the systemic modern understanding of science and rationality that Ambedkar shows. पेरियार के साथ एक और प्रॉब्लम ये है कि मतलब एक तो नेशनल प्रॉब्लम है कि पेरियार वाज स्टैंडिंग अप नॉट फॉर नेशनलिज्म बट एक some kind of a regional chauvinism, and at its worst even regional secessionism. So from a nationalistic point of view तो पेरियार is inadmissible, but from the point of view of social values also, I think Periyar is not the kind of thinker that Ambedkar is. They belong, I think, to uh, very different sort of levels. At a bare minimum level, what we can say is that Periyar did talk about social justice. Periyar did talk about progressive values uh, in in that society जहाँ पे हो सकता है उस समय absent रही हूँ. But in long term, I think Ambedkarite program is much more amenable because it is forward looking and it actually accepts the total framework of Indian civilization as a whole, unlike Periyar.
Okay.
I think Varun wants to say something. Varun, आप जो कमेंट किए हैं आप बोल भी सकते हैं.
Hey,
Okay.
I'm typing because my mic is not working very well. It keeps cutting
Okay.
out. Yeah.
Do you want me to repeat your comment? Okay, I can repeat your comment. So Varun is making the point that actually this is a discussion that we had in a SASC session previously. I think it is the same point. Periyar was a reactionary that doesn't lend itself to timelessness. You can make excellent points being a reactionary, but it rarely comes from or results in framework making. Yeah, that's it. I completely agree with that. I don't understand how what would be a Periyarite framework for society or social justice. I don't really get that coming out of Periyar. There is a lot of myth making around Periyar in Tamil Nadu, a sort of like Gandhi like myth making in Tamil Nadu, but that is because I think because of political mobilization around him. Because even superficially, the values that he talked about, you do not see them expressed in Tamil politics.
Mm-hmm. Maybe like Periyar, I think was like the Periyarist movement, and even Periyar is more for a power grab, the end to conclusion of their movement, maybe, while Ambedkar was like in general society's welfare. So maybe.
ये प्रॉब्लम एक्चुअली इंडिया में हर चीज के साथ हो सकती है. अम्बेडकर ऑल्सो कैन बी टर्न इनटू एक टूल फॉर पावर ग्रैब. ऑलरेडी बहुत समय और बहुत बार ऐसा हो चुका है. तो ये प्रॉब्लम हमारे इंडिया में सब चीज़ों के साथ होती है. बट मेरा जो आप बोल रहे हैं वो सही है कि इंटरनल पोटेंशियल जो है अम्बेडकर में, आई थिंक फॉर ए वाइड वैरायटी ऑफ अदर थिंग्स इज बेटर देन पेरियार.
Okay.
If you can you hear me? Can you hear
हाँ
my voice? This mic, it's okay.
हाँ वरुण, वी कैन
Yeah,
हियर यू.
very well.
Okay. So the thing with, if you notice this about Periyar, even his successors could not use any framework of his creation. They made frameworks of their own. So the DMK that you see now, you cannot really credit the Periyar. They might pay lip service to him. They might give him credit, whatever it is. But it is his contemporaries and his descendants who truly made the framework that the DMK pushes for Tamil Nadu, right? So that is why they needed to do the Tamil consolidation and stuff like that, because in all of Periyar's readings there is no cohesive idea of what should be the thrust for the individual. What should the individual do next after reading this book or reading this speech? What is the culmination of this person's path? But see, even if you don't like it, his successors were able, by forming a Tamil identity, whether you like it or not, the his successors, his contemporaries, were able to do a much better job of actually creating a framework. And you can see that it's successful because they keep getting voted into power. Whether you think it is they're getting voted there because of doing paying people off or whatever it keeps happening, and they've stayed in power. So I don't think Periyar even counts when you're talking about framework making. Whereas Ambedkar was functioning with a full framework of thinking, and I think that uh, one of the reasons that some of his earlier work is more interesting, I think on the group as well, I had linked his very interesting first constitution that was very, very different from the constitution that you could argue he was either forced or felt dutifully compelled to play along with when he worked with when he worked in the wow, I forgot the name of the committee. But if you see that first constitution, it gives you an entire vision of what he was thinking. I can link it to you again on the group, or maybe you're already familiar with it. It was called States and something. It was the it had a preamble and it had an entire section. It also had a section on how he thought of states, and his essential idea was it was socialist because he was influenced by socialism, but his essential idea was something more like the United States of America. It was not what Sardar Patel eventually achieved with what we have today. It's a very interesting piece of work. So you can see that in all through Ambedkar's life, and you see that even in his reversals of his previous views, you will find sometimes Ambedkar saying that the constitution is useless. The constitution that he worked on in his later life, he said it was useless and he doesn't work for anyone. Comments like that. That's because I think we really have to understand that Ambedkar was also a working professional, and a lot of times as a lawyer and as in his role he was doing things as part of his duty. But I think Priyank touched upon this a little a few times in the group and as well as here. It That is why it becomes important to read both his earlier works as well as his works on the actual structure of society and things like that. Because if you look at Ambedkar's work as a lawmaker, it can really distract you from what he actually thought, because a lot of it was influenced by what he felt dutifully compelled to do. That is my input on Ambedkar as a lawmaker and a framework maker.
Thank you. There is a question here by CW. What do you think of the reading of Ambedkar by Rajiv Malhotra in his books? I think I'm not familiar. आप मुझे short में can you tell me in short मतलब what is his reading of Ambedkar? CW जी आपने नाम नहीं लिखा है या फिर कोई और जानता हो तो?
I don't know properly, but मैंने शायद tweet देखा था राजीव मल्होत्रा का. I have not read his book. In tweet he says Ambedkar's understanding of Buddhism पे उन्होंने लिखा था. I don't think caste पे कुछ लिखा था या लिखा है तो I'm not aware, but उन्होंने लिखा था Buddhism understanding of Ambedkar is not appropriate. So that was his.
हाँ ये एक्चुअली काफ़ी इम्पोर्टेंट क्वेश्चन है और ये मैं बहुत बार देखते रहता हूँ. ये जो क्वेश्चन है ना कि अंबेडकर मिस इंटरप्रेटेड बुद्धिज्म, इसमें हमें एक चीज़ जाननी पड़ेगी कि अंबेडकर वाज नॉट ए स्कॉलर ऑफ बुद्धिज्म. अंबेडकर वाज आप अंबेडकर के दिमाग के हिसाब से सोचो, अंबेडकर के दिमाग में क्या है कि बुद्धिज्म एक फोर्स ऑफ रिलीजन है जो इंडिया में फॉर सम रीजन उनके हिसाब से मतलब मेनिशनिज्म विद इन हिंदुइज्म जो डिस्ट्रॉय हो गया था, वो उस फोर्स को एक फुल पोटेंशियल मतलब एक फुल पोटेंट फोर्स ऑफ रिलीजन के रूप में दोबारा शुरू कर रहे हैं. खुद को बोधिसत्व नहीं बोला बट बाद में लोगों ने जिनको बोधिसत्व बोला है, तो उसके हिसाब से यू हैव टू थिंक ऑफ हिम एज ए रिलीजियस रिवाइवलिस्ट. तो ही इज नॉट ए पर्सन हु इज सेइंग कि बुद्धा ने XYZ बोला है एंड आई एम डूइंग गोइंग टू मतलब XYZ को मैं ऐसे अब अप्लाई करूंगा. नो, ही इज रिलीजन के अंदर जो भी इनोवेशन होती है ना, रिलीजन का बेसिक वो जो है फैक्ट नहीं है. रिलीजन के अंदर जो भी इनोवेशन होती है इट इज बियॉन्ड फैक्ट, it touches bare life itself. So what Ambedkar was interested in Buddhism from his point of view was कि there is a modern sense of aesthetics which not aesthetics ethics, एक modern sense of supreme ethics which are universal in nature, which are human in nature, जिनका एसेंस बुद्धिज्म में भी था पहले और जो भी इंडियन सोसाइटी में नहीं है, तो अब मैं उसको शुरू करूंगा। ये उसके हिसाब से है। अब उसके लिए क्रिएटिव रीइंटरप्रिटेशन ऑफ बुद्धिज्म और एनी रिलीजन इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट टू एनी रिलीजियस इनोवेटर। दूसरा पॉइंट है कि one very important break that he makes from any older form of Buddhism is that self-consciously he says कि his Buddhism is socially engaged, not just spiritually engaged. उसका आइडिया जो निर्वाण का है वो एक सोशल इमेंसिपेशन का है, वो सिर्फ स्पिरिचुअल इमेंसिपेशन का नहीं है। तो ये सब तो अम्बेडकर खुद बोल रहा है ना। उसके बाद जब ऐसा लोग बोलते हैं कि हिज बुद्धिज्म इज नॉट ओल्ड बुद्धिज्म, तो दैट इज लाइक एक ट्रूइज्म काइंड ऑफ ए थिंग। तो उसमें मतलब यू कैन स्टिल हैव ए प्रॉब्लम विद दैट इफ यू बिलीव इन द आइडिया कि रिलीजन हैज ओनली वन डिस्टिंक्ट फॉर्म जो बाद में कभी चेंज नहीं हो सकती, देन यू कैन से दैट। बट दैट इज डिफरेंट फ्रॉम सेइंग कि उसने कुछ मतलब ऐसा इंडियन पॉपुलेशन के ऊपर वो प्रैंक कर दिया है कि बुद्धिज्म तो ये
Correct.
था ही नहीं, कुछ ऐसा बना दिया।
Hmm. No, so I think I saw the tweet. He's like, okay, I mean, he's rather praising Ambedkar कि उन्होंने as a cure for the societal ills, he didn't join hand with Abrahamic religion. उन्होंने बुद्धिज्म ही चूज किया. So in a way that was a contribution of nation building ही था उनका वो, कि मतलब he didn't कि नहीं इस्लाम है, हिंदुइज्म करा तो इस्लाम से, उन्होंने वो नहीं किया. And he's saying that maybe he was wrong in that, but at least he was फॉर नेशन बिल्डिंग, मतलब ऐसा उन्होंने लिखा है जो मैं ट्वीट देख रहा हूँ. अगेन हिज बुक माइट ड्वेल डीप इनटू हिज अंडरस्टैंडिंग ऑफ अम्बेडकर. बट हाँ, आपका
हाँ,
पॉइंट्स
वो
आई
बुक
थिंक.
में जो बुक वाला पार्ट है मैंने पढ़ा नहीं है, इसलिए मैं सोच रहा था कि जो क्वेश्चन पूछा है जिन्होंने वो मुझे बता सके कुछ, बट आई थिंक ही इज
करेक्ट.
नॉट हियर करंटली। एक चीज और थी, जैसे अभी आपकी बात करने से मुझे ध्यान आया कि दिस थिंग ना कि ही डिड नॉट चूज एनी अदर रिलीजन, इसको भी मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि गलत समझने के बहुत सारे तरीके हैं। कुछ लोग
ओके.
इस मुझे नहीं लगता कि इसको ऐसा मानना चाहिए कि उन्होंने हम पे कृपा की। उसको एक इंडिपेंडेंटली अराइव्ड एट एकदम रैशनल डिसीजन मानना चाहिए कि इवन फॉर दैट सेक्शन ऑफ पीपल दैट ही वांटेड टू लीड देयर, उनके लिए भी अंबेडकर का कंसिडर्ड रैशनल डिसीजन है कि उनका फ़ायदा जो है डी नेशनलाइजेशन में नहीं है। ये उनके खुद के वर्ड्स हैं। तो दिस इज एक इंडिपेंडेंटली अराइव्ड रैशनल उनकी खुद की डिसीजन, इसका हमें रिस्पेक्ट करना चाहिए एज ए मतलब पर्सन हु वाज ए सॉर्ट ऑफ रिलीजियस फाउंडर ऐसा।
अग्रीड. मतलब काफी थॉटफुल था वो डिसीजन, मतलब उसके पीछे काफी थिंकिंग गई थी उनकी कि ये स्टेप जो
बिल्कुल
लेना है.
बिल्कुल। कोई और क्वेश्चंस हैं किसी के, या फिर ऐसे ही डिस्कशन हम कर सकते हैं? अभी तो मतलब वो हो गया, हमारा सेशन होगा। अच्छा, एक सिंपल क्वेश्चन मेरा ही है कि आप जो लोग हैं, आपने पूरा सेशन वो किया है, मैनी ऑफ यू माइट हैव थॉट अलोंग दिस लाइंस बिफोर। आपको क्या लगता है कि अंबेडकर के साथ मतलब किस लेवल की पोटेंशियल पे इंगेज किया जा सकता है? क्योंकि देखो, एक बहुत कंसिडर्ड व्यू है, एक बहुत ही बेसिक कंसिडर्ड व्यू जो हिंदुज्म के अंदर से आता है, और बहुत ही इम्पल्सिव व्यू जो आता है वो ये है कि अंबेडकर को रिजेक्ट कर दो पूरा। एंड आई एम नॉट सेइंग कि देयर इज ए रीजन फॉर दैट व्यू व्हाई इट कम्स। Okay, sorry. Jay what I'm saying is कि after going through this session, or you people might have thought about questions like this before, do you see any other kind of have you thought of मतलब potential in Ambedkar in any other terms? Because I think the most impulsive and reactionary uh, impulse that comes from within Hindu society towards Ambedkar is that of rejection, of a complete rejection, that this person does not matter, he has to be ignored. As a rejection, this kind of rejection is the impulse that comes. But what I have tried to show in this session is that is not a good idea. We need to engage with Ambedkar in different terms. Without, like, obviously we can't accept all of his prescription. Yeah, Varun, please go ahead. मुझे पता है आपके पास कुछ इंटरेस्टिंग होगा।
Don't know about that, but so I think even to people who are not well read with Ambedkar, there is this idea, and I don't know how far back it goes, which is accurate, of course, that Ambedkar rejected Hinduism. He was against it. Now, what I feel is that that itself was the first moment of bad PR. whatever the good reason for it was. Because I think that a lot of rejection of Ambedkar from Hindus, especially educated Hindus, is coming from the fact that he rejected first. So it is again a retaliatory rejection, in for the most part. Because if let's take it like this: if imagine for a second that he did not do that. Imagine for a second that Ambedkar did not say, I reject Hindu society. I think Hindu society cannot be reformed. Imagine he did say that it can. Imagine he didn't make a new form of Buddhism. Imagine that he tried to make a new form of Hinduism. Now, what would have most likely happened is that even if he would have been heterodox, because if you reject the Vedas, you become heterodox. But we have seen through history, through Indian religious history, that heterodox schools are not ignored. They are generally absorbed, or things are taken from them that people want, and they are incorporated into the mainstream, right? So the point I'm making is that I don't think that there was ever really a difficulty with doing a Hindu reading of Ambedkar. I think it's coming from a sort of immature retaliatory reaction to his rejection of Hinduism.
मुझे इसमें what I think around this, Varun, is there are 2 points. The first, you have read Ambedkar, so you would also know this argument
Yeah,
that this whole question that in Hinduism you see heterodoxy also
yeah,
being given a place.
yeah,
Even before Ambedkar, there were people like caste reformers, right? There were caste reformer even from Dalit community.
right.
But this substantial point that Ambedkar is trying to make, and hence his total rejection of Hinduism,
Yeah, yeah,
is that he thought that none of this was enough. None of this was ever enough.
yeah,
He rejects every Dalit reformer except 2, I think.
yeah.
He accepts one of the uh, uh, what are those people called, the exalted Tamil Vaishnav saints? Are they called Nanmars?
You're talking about oof, so slow today. You're
Huh,
talking
I think
about
they are called
Nayanas. Nayanas.
Nanars, I think.
Yeah,
Huh. So one of those who was a Dalit, I think saying Dalit might be wrong here, but who came from that social category, one of those,
sorry.
and
Yeah, you're talking about the Alvars, not the
oh, sorry,
Nayanas.
yeah,
Is
yeah,
Thailand. Yeah,
I'm talking about
yeah,
Alvars. So one of the Alvars who came from the Shudra community, one of those, and Sant Tukaram. Except for these 2,
yeah,
he rejected all the other Dalit reformers because he said, "Ki you did this reform project inside Hinduism, and none of this actually came to happen, and you are merely literary figures." That was his kind of.
yeah,
So there is a reason he gave up on this project of Hindu reform.
yeah,
Firstly, because he thought of Hindu reform in Hindu history as hypocritical,
yeah,
and second, because also how he saw the fate of the project of Hindu reforms in his own time.
yeah.
For those 2 reasons, I think he might have rejected the possibility of Hindu reform. And
Right.
let me be frank with you, there is
Yeah,
a very strong possibility that if he had done only Hindu reform,
yeah.
then he might have been forgotten to history. I'm pretty sure.
Yes. So actually, the thing is that I wasn't criticizing him at all. In fact, I agree with a lot of his approach. I think his hostility to Hinduism was important. What I was talking about is more the people now, which is what they do with it. So my comment is more that I think I'm talking about Hindus as they react to Ambedkar. My view is that it is simply a reactionary view towards their perception of his hostility. Now, in general, my point is that a Hindu reading of Ambedkar is entirely possible if you do not take his rejection of Hinduism personally, as you would any other critic. But because so many Hindus take it so personally, I think that very simple emotional blockade is
Right.
what is making it so hard, especially on the right wing, for that matter. Because there is nothing in what he says that is uh, especially inflammatory in a way that is sure he said some stuff, but it really isn't something that you can't skip over. He has created a
Exactly.
large body of work. He has said a lot of things that people who are disagreeing with would agree with. So it's just an emotional block, is my point. I'm not talking about Ambedkar. I actually agree. I think he was right to reject Hinduism at the time that he did in the way that he did.
I
I
think
don't
that
think.
emotional
Yeah,
block also comes from a legitimate place within Hinduism,
yeah,
because for us that question of conversion is like a kind of violence. Hindus
yeah,
have always thought of these attempts at conversion as violence,
yeah,
and Ambedkar's conversion was not even like normal conversion.
yeah,
He
yeah,
went out of his way, those 22 vows, even
yeah,
though the language of those vows is so violent. That is
yeah.
why I think this kind of emotional idea, I think it comes
Right,
from that idea of conversion as violence.
right. But at the end of the day, it is. I mean, I don't know what you can do with this observation, but at the end of the day, it is unstrategic on part of the Hindu fold, because the only way ever that has ever been um, to absorb a critic's best points is to ignore the stuff you don't like and take the stuff you like. It's just unstrategic. So until that changes, until that blockade changes, I don't think it's going to work. Because at the I don't really know if so. There is a gap in my knowledge on Ambedkar's who his alternatives could be, because we have discussed a few people like Santu Karam and people that you mentioned in the group. Very interesting reading, by the way. I should really thank. I forgot who linked it to me, but it was beautiful stuff. I read through the entire set of articles that was linked, but it still didn't give me a clear idea of if if you were to if you were to speak about India at this sociological level or this anti-caste level, who is the alternative to Ambedkar? Who would you offer? Who would? Just an open question. Who is the alternative to Ambedkar really? From all the people that I've heard till now, if you have to throw a bone and say yes, maybe the anti-caste people are right, I can't think of a single person who could inspire as much as he would. So there itself, you have a problem.
अच्छा इसमें एक सिंपल चीज है, everybody born before like that colonial period, I think they are simply ruled out of this question, because they would simply not have had the intellectual technology, or that the words that Ambedkar is using, those are like national and global in nature. So that impetus of change that Ambedkar had, that was not available to caste reformers of the previous variety,
Fair
who
enough.
always rebelled against the caste system, not in toto, but only against the concept of that absence of human dignity and hierarchy वाला concept जो था.
Yeah. Yeah.
हाँ, तो एक true attack against caste system, I would say, is became possible in India only after, I think, modern period.
Yeah. Someone has a question on the messages.
Yeah, Jayaprakash wrote something. ये Jayaprakash, I think you were a bit late because this question was addressed in the first slide. कि this is how the Hindu reading of Ambedkar has been so far, and जब तक ऐसी रहेगी तब तक मतलब you can't actually move all of these discussion forward. You can only मतलब you can appropriate him on the question of Islam, you can appropriate him on some other question, or maybe on the question of regionalism. But ultimately, that is the crux of this session. A Hindu reading has to understand and explore all of his work, and of which the most important work is actually the one that we neglect most, which is this centrality to the caste question. tomorrow is death anniversary of another great social reformer, G. Agarkar. Yeah, Vardhan, can you tell us a little bit about him? उसके साथ हम maybe we can end the call. I don't think most people might be familiar with him. Okay, ठीक है. You can share the article in group. I don't think there are any more questions now. I think we can end the session. Are there any more questions? Okay. Okay. Thanks to all of you for being here. I think this was a really interesting session for me also. This can be refined और आगे अच्छे से refine किया जा सकता है. But this is a conversation that I think we need to have. बाकी और कुछ discussion वगैरह है तो I think we can have that in the group. Thank you all for attending, and thanks especially to Vardhan for organizing this, for making me organize this. Okay, good night to all of you.